Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have some free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink and its tests are real old. They're really, really old. I've been putting off doing this test for, I'm not kidding, probably going on 2 years? Yeah. This has been completed for a while, to the point where I don't have any Fabriano. I don't have any chemical tests. I only used one pen. I have the really, really old and much missed, freakishly well-behaved copier paper. Yep. Now, the ink in question is by DeAtramentis, and it is one of the ones named for famous people. This one is named for Charles Dickens. Now, while Chuck and I do not necessarily agree when it comes to literature, I had horrible experiences in high school because the man was paid by the letter or the word or something. So he'd like 7 pages talking about the food at the table on a feast and I'm getting tested on it. Like, anyways, I love A Christmas Carol. Probably has some of the best opening lines of literature ever. But yeah, overall he and I just don't get along. The ink, however, was what drew me to it. Drew me to like the color, you know, less the person. And it's a very fascinating green gray. In fact, I think it's Charles Dickens ink is just a rebottled version of their cement gray, if I remember correctly. Definitely has some green components. Also, I was taught in high school that he was taken out of school to help get his father out of debtor's prison, and one of the things he did was that he bottled ink. Turns out, no, it was shoe polish, but, you know, there's high school for you. Now, the one pen that I used was this JinHao X450, and I love my X450s because they tend to be pretty broad and pretty wet, but they tend to be pretty broad and pretty wet, so the cheaper papers are not going to be able to handle it quite as well. And actually about a year ago, I refilled another one of these with this ink so that I could do the Tomoe River paper, because that's just how old these tests were. It was like before I had Tomoe River practically. So, I've been holding on to it for a while, just a heads up. And this was right around the time I was figuring out DeAtramentis syndrome. Now, what is DeAtramentis syndrome? It's a pattern that I've noticed. The longer an ink is out of a vessel, especially a bottle, and in a pen, the worse the performance gets. It gets exponentially worse the longer it's been out of its proper container. What does that mean? It gets more woolly, it gets more aggressive behaving, it can bleed more, it can feather more. I did not take note of that in this test because, as I said, this was one of the very early tests when I was first noticing it. So, but we'll get to that. Comparisons. Here is DeAtramentis Charles Dickens, and here is Jérôme's VittaR. You can see this is maybe just a little bit more green, almost like a little bit of brown undertones. This one definitely has more gray. Next is, sorry, hiccup, Diamine Graphite, which, funnily enough, here looks just very straight gray, but when you look at it on its own, you can definitely tell that it has some green in it. Next up is Graf von Faber-Castell's Stone Gray, which definitely has some green in it, but it's sort of a different kind of green. It's a different kind of gray, and this one actually has some purple undertones, and I love that gray. And then, yes, next up is Diamine Salamander. Now, I have well over 600 swatches at this point, and yes, these were the ones that were closest. In my defense, I think VittaR came pretty close. But then Salamander was fourth. Now, Salamander is a fascinating ink, but, yeah, so. Anyways, let's check out the chromatography. Now, I only have the one chromatography, because that's just how old this is. I haven't updated it. So, it's the standard chromatography, where you put the drop of ink and then instantly dunk it in the water. But I feel like this reveals enough. You can tell that it's going to have some water resistance. And this is very common in a lot of DeAtramentis inks. They'll have this gray at the base that will resist water, and then a lot of the color will wash off. And as you can probably tell, there's definitely some green in there. And there's actually some almost like hints of purple right at the edges. So Clairefontaine, 90 grams per square meter. Now, as you might be able to tell, this came from a very small notebook. And actually, I didn't know it at the time, but when I bought this notebook, the notebook was in bad condition. Essentially, it had aged badly. It had been oxygenated. It just... Paper ages. It does. Its exposure to air can affect its ability to function well, I guess you could say. And so that's what happened to this. When I bought it, it was already in bad condition. So we get this, where you can practically read it from the back. And yes, there's a good bit of bleed, or near bleed, a ton of show through. We get an intense woolliness, like we have a woolly texture. There's not a lot of shading. It took 8 seconds to dry because, I mean, even though it's a broad and wet pen, and this is super dense paper, it just essentially, like, oxygen and time sort of forced the pores of the paper open, and so, yeah, it did not go well. However, we do have a very impressive water test. If you look at it, it only sort of expanded a little. You've got little hints of maybe a little bit of feathering at the bottom, but and some of the green is coming out the back, but that's about it. So, recoverable? Absolutely. Now, next up is Rhodia. 80 grams per square meter, because yes, I did not test Fabriano yet at this stage. But this is proper Rhodia, unlike the Clairefontaine that was badly aged. This stuff is the stuff you would expect. Now, it took 22 seconds to dry here. We have some nice shading. You can see sort of the facets of where green and gray meet. It's rather nice. No bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, mostly because the paper is dense enough that you can't see it out the back. Water test is a little more in line with what you would expect because, again, I said it's more absorbent because it's been exposed to air, so it didn't want to let go, kind of like we see with cheaper papers. This one is a little more resistant. However, a very good degree of it remains. A lot of it, when I stopped up the water, took the ink with it so it didn't dye the page, leaving a good degree of contrast with the white background. This is absolutely recoverable. Didn't come out the back. Looks good. If you got that wet, you could definitely recover it. Now, next up is Tomoe River paper, which is known for drawing out shading and sheen and dry times and echo. And, yeah, we definitely got the shading. The thing is, it's sort of, since it's sort of like a foggy, like greenish gray, it's I don't know, it's sort of a subtle shading, and since it's coming out fairly wet on paper that takes so long to dry, it sort of gives the ink an opportunity to pool evenly across a stroke. So, yeah, but we do get a little bit of a dark halo effect around the wettest parts. It took 25 seconds to dry, which makes sense because that's something this paper does. It just, yeah, it doesn't want to let things absorb, so it takes a long time for dry. Now, this is a fairly darkish gray-green ink, and this is extremely thin paper, and this was a broad and wet pen, so if you are very sensitive to echo like I am, this might get on your nerves a little. I don't know, could be a bit worse. Now, yeah, no bleed, no feather, no spread. It's Tomoe River. It just doesn't do that. However, Tomoe River does love to let ink slide away when you add more water. Here, it actually really didn't. I mean, yes, it got lighter, but it's still pretty darn dark and readable. If you had to recover that, you absolutely could. Now, next up is the 20-pound copier paper I didn't know that I would miss. I thought that this was like your basic 20-pound paper. I got it from the office I used to work in. I thought it was just, you know, whatever. The thing is, I didn't realize how good it was until I had to find some other copier paper. Yeah, so you saw what this did to 90 gram per square meter Rhodia, right? How it got woolly, and it has no shading, and it was coming out the back. This, I think, is just like great white, 15% recycled, something or other, you know, but here we get some shading. And we don't really get any feathering. That was me smearing from, well, I went like that. That's what that's that D is. Took 6 seconds to dry. There is no bleed at all. Not even in the water test. I miss this paper. Anyways, I mean, I guess the really awful stuff really shows you how, you know, gives a scale for how bad it can be, but I miss this stuff. Anyways, it is a more absorbent paper. It tends to draw the ink in, make it harder to wash out. And that's sort of what happened here. We can definitely see where the ink was put down. It's very clear, very legible, very there. It didn't feather, didn't explode, didn't start releasing some colors and not others. It's absolutely recoverable. Now next up is Mead Notebook Paper, which is very common for school children in the United States, and this stuff came from a small composition notebook. Now this stuff is very inexpensive. It is large pulp print paper. It's a disaster. Yeah, we have no shading at all. We have tons of feathering and intense wooliness. It's gone very flat because, like, even the copier paper retains some shading, but here it's just kind of gone sort of meh. But yeah, there's a lot of bleed through. A lot. It rendered onto the page below and a lot of tiny dots. But again, this is, I mean, I used a broad and wet pen on super cheap paper. I mean, the freakishly miraculous, I miss it so much, 20 pound can handle it, but come on, this is Mead. This stuff is physically thinner than 20 pound. It's extremely cheaply made. Honestly, I'm terrified what this same setup would do with the 20 pound paper I have now. But anyways, water test. The stuff at the center is clear and it's there, but you can see this light green is trying to wash away, kind of like we saw there, and so that's a little distracting, but I don't know. I guess if you wrote really big like I did, it might be recoverable, but it probably wouldn't be the easiest task in the world. And lastly is Moleskine Notebook Paper, which actually behaved pretty much like I thought it would. You know, it's terrible. There's like no good shading. You can see the texture of the pulp they mashed into the paper. Come on, camera. Camera. There we go. Yeah, it's just a disaster. It took 6 seconds to dry. There is insane feathers, and they are literally touching every single inch of this. Yes, it is a fairly broad and wet pen, and yes, this is some of the worst paper ever, especially for the price they make you pay for it. So it's asking a lot. However, it's a train wreck. It's a train wreck. We used to get, I'm not even kidding, like, so you know, there's reams, and then there were boxes, and boxes had usually between 10 or 20 reams in them, and we used to get them 10 boxes at a time at the place where I worked, and this paper can handle this. And like, this was the stuff that we just like fed through our giant copy machine. This does this. And like, as it advertises itself as like, oh, we're the notebook of like artist type people, except everyone except fountain pen users, apparently. Because there's no shading. It's just, it looks like a flock of peacocks on parade. There's just crazy bold feathers everywhere. Water test, I guess, could be worse. I mean, parts of it did feather and explode, but if you use gigantic writing like I did, it would probably remain legible, but if you use smaller writing right on top of each other, it probably wouldn't go so well. But, I mean, there is something. I don't know. If you had to recover that, maybe you could. Yeah, so there you go. For your consideration from the Triple N Network, DeAtramentis Charles Dickens. I've been holding on to this test for quite a while. Not exactly sure why. I should probably retest it again. The thing is, like, I'm hesitant because I really like this ink, and these bottles only have 35 milliliters, and I think I'm down to, like, there. So I've started to use it kind of sparingly. But, yeah. Anyways, there you go. Blast from the past. For your consideration from the Triple N Network, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.